Mount Everest is known as the top of the world, and people have long admired its beauty. While many attempted to climb the mountain, many perished. It wasn't until May 29, 1953, that men finally reached its summit and lived to tell the tale. Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reached the summit of the mountain on that very day, and the lives of climbers have not been the same since. Years after the first summit, there was one particular expedition season that was unlike any other. The 1996 summit attempt on May 10th was a disaster that will never be forgotten. At 29,035 feet above sea level, Everest sits alone above all else. As the highest peak on Earth, Everest is an extreme challenge. Reaching its summit is the ultimate in human endurance and achievement. People are even willing to pay large sums of money to satisfy that longing. This has created an industry where seasoned climbers are paid to take groups of less seasoned climbers on planned expeditions up the mountain. Reaching the summit is always the ultimate goal. Getting there is another story. There are many obstacles in the way. Climbers never know if the storms will subside long enough to even allow for a successful summit attempt. There is a very small window each year in late spring that the clouds lift for long enough to allow climbers through to its peak. Even with the weather on their side, the climb is always perilous. Climbers have to navigate through harsh winds, dangerous obstacles, icy terrain, and many other barriers that elevate the dangers of Everest. In high altitude in the bitter cold, a person is more susceptible to frostbite. Additionally, the very high altitude can cause a lot of damage. Humans aren't meant to survive this high up. Anywhere over 26,000 feet and above is called the death zone because humans are slowly dying as long as they are in it. They can only survive by moving out of the death zone and getting back to a safer altitude. Because of this, humans climbing above the death zone must plan to get in and out of it quickly. Getting up and down the mountain is not easy to do, and it can be very slow going. On the way up the mountain, climbers have to spend weeks, even months, acclimating their bodies and lungs to the altitude, so they can survive at higher altitudes without getting sick. Veteran climbers Rob Hall and Scott Fisher were two climb leaders, leading expeditions on Everest in 1996. Both were famous climbers that had summited Everest and many other mountains before. Born in New Zealand, Rob Hall had been climbing all his life. He had climbed all 7 of the highest summits in the world in just 7 months, and he was a veteran on Everest. He had been leading paid expeditions on the mountain for years. Scott Fisher was a well-known and well-liked American climber with many climbing accomplishments. He ran a competing company that also guided less experienced climbers up Mount Everest. In early April 1996, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher led their teams the 17-mile trek to base camp from Nepal. Once at base camp, Rob, Scott, and their teams had to become used to the high altitude before climbing any higher on the mountain. They continued their slow acclimation as they climbed to Camp 2, then back to Base Camp, Camp 3, again back to Base Camp, and so on. After leaving Base Camp, the climbers would make the dangerous trek up the Khumbu Icefall. This is the part of the mountain that has claimed the largest number of lives over the years. Climbers then continue up to Camp 1 and through the Western Khum to Camp 2. Then they make their way to Camp 3, where they have to maneuver up Lhotse Face to reach Camp 4. Above this, the South Col and Hillary Step are the final barriers to reaching the summit. Finally, with their acclimation complete, they found themselves at Camp 4, preparing for a summit push. On the South Col on May 10th, between midnight and 2 a.m., the teams departed for the summit. Rob Hall gave his team the goal of reaching the summit by noon, with specific instructions to be heading back down by 2 p.m. to ensure everyone's safe return before they would run out of oxygen. Scott Fisher had arrived late and tired at Camp 4 after helping a sick client down the mountain, so he let his team go ahead while he tried to sleep a few more hours. This gave him a very late start for the summit, and he was far behind his team. When light started filling the sky in the early hours of the morning on May 10th, there were clear skies with few clouds. The team slowly trudged up single file through the crunchy snow. When Rob Hall got to the summit, he waited for more of his climbers, long after he himself had arrived. The previous year, due to enforcing his strict 2 p.m. turnaround time, Rob had denied the summit to his client, Doug Hansen. This year, Doug was back in order to try to make it to the summit. Therefore, Rob made an extra push to help Doug Hansen get there. At 4 p.m. that day, Rob helped a tired Hansen to the top of the mountain. Upon their descent, the clouds started to roll in. The wind sped up and a blizzard started, making visibility very limited. Rob and Doug were just beneath the summit when the storm hit, while others were still descending.
It was the most violent and fast-moving and loud storm I have heard in my entire 36 years of climbing in the Himalayan region, and it came out of nowhere.
In the chaos of the storm, 4 members of Scott Fisher's team and 2 of Rob's were stranded just 20 minutes from the shelter of Camp 4. They were in desperate need of help, and a few of them were close to death. One of Scott Fisher's guides, Anatoly Bukriv, went out to find climbers who had not returned. When he found the group, he was able to bring 4 back with him to safety. Beck Weathers and Yasuku Namba were left for dead. Back at base camp, contact was made with Rob Hall, who was up near the summit with Doug Hansen. Doug had run out of oxygen, and Rob couldn't get him moving. His base camp crew pleaded with Rob to get moving, but he would not leave Doug. So they sent 2 Sherpas to climb up to Rob with extra oxygen to help them down. Scott Fisher had been passed on his way up the mountain, but like the others, he had not yet returned to Camp 4. He was missing on the mountain in the storm. One of his team Sherpas found him and tried to get him moving, but was unsuccessful. Fisher would not make it off the mountain. The Sherpas on their way to Rob were unable to make it through the storm. They had to turn around. The base camp team knew that this meant Rob would probably die. They contacted Rob to let him know that the Sherpas had to turn around. He told them that Doug was gone. With the blizzard raging around him, Rob was unable to move to get himself off the mountain.
The reason it was so intense, it had been forming as a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal. It just came up that valley. And I was looking at clear blue skies, watching climbers on the south summit and crossing over to the Hillary Step with a telescope. And up comes this cloud and with thunder and lightning, which I'd never heard on Everest, ever. And then within half an hour, they were overrun with 80-mile-an-hour winds, minus 30, minus 40 degree temperatures, thick snow, and darkness.
Later that night, a satellite call from his wife, Jane Arnold, was connected to Rob's radio, and they were able to speak a final time. He told her, "I love you. Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." Those were the last words that anybody heard Rob Hall speak. Out of nowhere, the people in Camp 4 saw a person slowly walking towards camp. It was Beck Weathers, risen from the dead. Despite being left for dead during the storm, he had awoken and managed to stand. Thoughts of his family kept him moving in search of camp, with the single goal of surviving. He was severely frostbitten and very sick. While many perished that day on the mountain in the storm, many rallied to help survivors. The IMAX crew was on the mountain filming when the storm hit. Once they heard that Beck Weathers had survived but was in critical condition, they immediately stopped their production in order to help him down the mountain. A helicopter pilot, risking his own life, flew higher than a helicopter has ever flown before in order to help fly Beck to safety. Beck Weathers survived that day. Sadly, 8 others did not. To this day, about 240 people have died on Mount Everest since 1953. The dangers and tragedies do not seem to stop people from wanting to climb this mountain. In the 20 years since this disastrous day, people are still drawn to Mount Everest. People still want to stand at the top of the world. People still want to undergo the ultimate test to their own endurance. However, the danger of climbing this mountain demands respect. As the Sherpas say, the mountain has the final say.